The silver chains bit so deeply into Ilara's wrists that the scent of her own scorching flesh overpowered the suffocating stench of her pack's betrayal. She was entirely alone, kneeling on the freezing marble of the Alpha's hall, condemned not for the death of her vicious husband, but for the audacity of surviving him. The gavel struck, sealing her fate, but beneath her carefully crafted mask of terror, a fierce, silent relief ignited in her chest. "You are a blight on the Crescent Moon Pack, Ilara," Alpha Thorn's voice boomed, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. Her father, the man who had sold her to a low-ranking violent brute just to secure a border treaty. Thorn's alpha aura crashed down on the room, a localized shift in gravity that forced the breath from the lungs of every wolf present. The atmospheric pressure in the hall doubled. Ilara's spine bowed under the invisible weight, her forehead pressing against the ice-cold marble. She didn't fight the physical subjugation. Instead, she used the posture to meticulously curl her body, shielding her lower abdomen from the ambient aggression. She focused on the scent of the room, the souring, rotting pine of her father's malice, the dusty copper of her own bleeding wrists, and the underlying musk of the pack's collective disdain. "A widowed Omega is useless to us," Thorn continued, pacing the dais. "But even trash can serve a purpose. We are sending you to the Deadlands as a peace offering to King Kalen of the North." A murmur of horror rippled through the gathered pack members. The Deadlands. King Kalen was known as the Mad King, a ruthless alpha who despised weakness and slaughtered trespassers without a second thought. Ilara kept her face pressed to the floor, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood to keep her expression neutral. It was a brilliant, cunning move on her father's part. Thorn didn't want peace. He knew King Kalen would likely execute a disgraced, pregnant-looking Omega on sight. When Kalen inevitably killed her, Thorn would have the political martyrdom he needed. He could parade her death before the Lycan Council, painting Kalen as a monster who slaughtered defenseless Omegas, thereby securing a coalition army to siege the North. She was to be the sacrificial pawn in a geopolitical masterstroke. But pawns can cross the board, Ilara thought, her mind sharpening into a razor's edge. "Please, Alpha," Ilara whimpered, forcing her voice to tremble, playing the pathetic role they expected. "The cold. I won't survive the journey." "That is not my concern," Thorn sneered. "Guards, take her to the northern ridge. Leave her at the boundary line." The physical mechanics of her extraction were brutal. 2 enforcers hauled her up by her armpits. Because her hands were bound behind her back with silver cuffs, Ilara could not balance herself. Her shoulders screamed in protest, joints popping dangerously as her center of gravity was violently shifted. She dragged her feet, ensuring she looked entirely helpless as they threw her into the back of a rusted transport jeep. The drive was a grueling, bone-rattling nightmare. For 2 hours, the temperature plummeted as they climbed toward the Deadlands. The silver cuffs seared a permanent ring of blistered, blackened flesh into her forearms. The poison was already seeping into her bloodstream, making her vision swim with gray spots. But she controlled her breathing. Panic would accelerate her heart rate. A faster heart rate meant the silver poison would spread quicker. She needed her wits intact. Finally, the jeep slammed to a halt. The howling wind of the northern ridge immediately ripped the heat from her bones. The enforcers dragged her out into the knee-deep snow. One of them, grumbling about the freezing wind, fumbled with a heavy iron key. With a painful clack, the silver cuffs fell away into the snow. The pack was too cheap to surrender weaponized silver to enemy territory. "Walk," the guard spat, giving her a hard shove between the shoulder blades that sent her sprawling face first into a snowbank. "Don't look back. If you step foot in Crescent territory again, we have orders to shoot." Ilara lay motionless in the snow, waiting until the crunch of their boots faded and the roar of the Jeep's engine disappeared down the mountain. Only then did she move. Her hands were severely compromised. The raw, burned flesh around her wrist throbbed with a sickening heat, and her fingers were stiff with frostbite and nerve damage. She couldn't use her hands to push herself up, so she rolled onto her side, using her elbows and knees to leverage her body upright against the howling gale. She didn't stumble blindly. Weeks ago, when she first realized her late husband's mysterious death would be pinned on her, Ilara had begun preparing. She turned exactly 45 degrees northeast, walking precisely 200 paces to a lightning-struck oak tree, sitting just inside the Deadlands border. Wincing in agony, using only the sides of her forearms, she dug into the hollowed trunk and dragged out a heavy, waterproof canvas bag she had smuggled out during a foraging run. Inside was a thick, insulated fur cloak, a map, a compass, and 3 vials of activated charcoal and crushed willow bark, a crude but necessary remedy to slow the silver poisoning ravaging her veins. With clumsy, agonizing effort, she managed to pull the cloak over her shivering shoulders. She slipped a hand beneath her thin tunic, resting her raw, blistered palm against the slight swell of her belly. Her husband hadn't touched her in a year. The child growing inside her belonged to the shadows of the winter solstice. A masked stranger she had collided with during her heat while fleeing one of her husband's drunken rages. She didn't know his face, only his towering silhouette and the intoxicating scent of crushed wolfsbane, wild honey, and the sharp bite of ozone before a thunderstorm. She was escaping. She was finally free. But as Ilara uncorked the vial of charcoal with her teeth, the wind suddenly shifted. The fur on the back of her neck stood up. A deep, primal vibration shook the snow beneath her boots. It wasn't the wind. It was an approaching border patrol, a massive one, and carried on the freezing gale, cutting through the scent of pine and ice, was a scent that made her heart slam against her ribs. Crushed wolfsbane, wild honey, lightning. He was here. Before she could even attempt to run, her legs, completely compromised by the spreading silver poison, gave out, plunging her back into the freezing dark. Consciousness returned in jagged, agonizing fragments. The first sensation was the biting cold, stealing the last remnants of heat from her trembling core. The second was the smell. It punched through the metallic tang of her own blood and the bitter frost, wrapping around her in an intoxicating, suffocating blanket. Crushed wolfsbane, wild honey, and the crackling ozone of a lightning strike. It was the scent of the winter solstice, the scent of the masked stranger in the dark. A heavy crunch of boots on packed snow sent tremors through the ground beneath her cheek. "Hold!" a dark, gravelly baritone commanded. The voice vibrated with such absolute, unquestionable authority that even the howling wind seemed to quiet in submission. Ilara forced her heavy eyelids open a fraction. A towering silhouette blocked out the pale moonlight. He wore heavy black furs draped over dark, scarred leather armor. King Kalen of the North, the Mad King. "A crescent-packed trespasser, my king," a gruff voice echoed from the ranks behind him. "Her wrists are burned. Silver cuffs. Looks like an exile. Shall I put her out of her misery?" "Step back, Jarek," Kalen rumbled. His alpha aura descended. Ilara braced herself for the crushing, breath-stealing vacuum of dominance she was used to from her father. But Kalen's aura was fundamentally different. It was the immense, unyielding pressure of the deep ocean, heavy enough to crush stone, yet strangely supportive, holding her fragile, shivering bones together rather than snapping them. He crouched beside her in the snow. Up close, the scent of wolfsbane was nearly blinding. He reached out, his bare, calloused fingers brushing against the frozen skin of her jaw to tilt her head up. The moment his skin made contact with hers, A violent, invisible jolt of electricity snapped between them. A desperate, primal warmth flooded Alara's freezing veins, pushing back the icy grip of the silver poison for one fleeting second. Kalen went dangerously still. His storm-gray eyes widened a fraction, flashing with a sudden feral gold. The mate spark. He felt it too, but he was an alpha king surrounded by his vanguard. His mask of ruthless indifference slammed back into place almost instantly. His gaze dropped from her eyes to the ruined, blackened flesh of her wrists, then to the vial of charcoal spilled in the snow near her mouth. Silver poisoning, Kalen muttered, his tone unreadable. And she was attempting to purge it herself. A resilient exile. Alara tried to speak, but her throat was swollen shut from the cold and the toxic shock. She was completely paralyzed, entirely at his mercy. Instead of ordering his guards to retrieve her, Kalen slid his massive arms beneath her shoulders and knees. As he hoisted her into the air, the sudden shift in gravity sent a spike of blinding agony through her ruined forearms. Alara fought through the gray fog consuming her mind. Protect the pup. Her hands were useless, necrotic lumps of fire, so she used the dead weight of her elbows to curl her body tightly inward, shielding her lower abdomen against his armored chest. Kalen's jaw clenched. He mistook her defensive curl for terror. He pulled his fur cloak tighter around her trembling frame, hiding her completely from his men's view. "We ride for the Obsidian Keep," Kalen commanded, his voice echoing over the frozen ridge. "Immediately." The journey was a blur of feverish torment. Alara faded in and out of consciousness, anchored to the world only by the rhythmic, thunderous gallop of Kalen's massive warhorse and the intoxicating, life-giving heat radiating from the Alpha King's chest. When she finally woke, the howling wind was gone. She was lying on a massive, fur-piled bed in a severe, cavernous stone chamber. A hearth fire roared nearby, casting dancing orange shadows against the dark granite walls. Alara tried to sit up, but her body instantly betrayed her. Her core muscles spasmed, and her wrists screamed in protest. She looked down. Her forearms were heavily wrapped in thick, coarse bandages. The overwhelming scent of crushed snow lily and kingsfoil filled the air, a potent traditional northern poultice used to draw out silver impurities. The agonizing, fiery burn in her veins had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache, but her fingers were entirely immobile, stiff with nerve damage. She was alive. The silver hadn't reached her heart. The heavy iron hinges of the chamber door groaned. Alara forced herself to stop struggling, instantly adopting a mask of calm composure. She couldn't fight, so she had to think. King Kalen stepped into the room. He had shed his heavy furs and armor, wearing only a dark, fitted tunic that did nothing to hide the raw, lethal power of his frame. In his large hand, he carried a familiar, wax-sealed parchment, the Crescent Pack insignia. Her father hadn't just dumped her. He had sent a formal declaration. "Your father's ravens arrived at my borders before you did," Kalen said smoothly, his boots making no sound on the stone floor as he approached the foot of her bed. He tossed the diplomatic scroll onto the mattress. "Alpha Thorn claims he has exiled his murderous, widowed daughter to my lands as a gesture of peace," Kalen continued, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers, studying her with terrifying intellect. He wasn't mad. He was entirely, dangerously lucid. "He expects me to execute you on sight. He wants me to slaughter a defenseless Omega, so he can run crying to the Lycan Council and secure a coalition army to siege the north." Alara's breath hitched. Kalen saw right through Thorn's geopolitical trap instantly. Kalen leaned closer, placing his large hands on the wooden footboard. The scent of wild honey and lightning flared with predatory interest, rolling over her in a wave of dominant inquiry. "You are the bait for a war, Alara of the Crescent Moon. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't oblige your father, and mount your head on a pike to send back to him." Despite her severe injuries, despite being deep in enemy territory, Ilara did not cower. She used her elbows to painstakingly prop herself up against the headboard, refusing to break eye contact. "Because," Ilara whispered, her voice raw and hoarse from the cold, but steady as steel, "if you keep me alive, I will give you the one thing my father fears more than you." Kalen went perfectly still, the golden ring around his pupils expanding. He raised a single dark brow. "And what is that, little wolf?" The silence in the stone chamber grew so absolute that Ilara could hear the violent crackle of the hearthfire and the erratic, painful thumping of her own heart. Kalen remained leaning over the footboard, his storm-gray eyes narrowed into predatory slits. The crushing weight of his alpha aura didn't attack her, but it filled every inch of the room, demanding the truth. "I am listening," Kalen rumbled, the vibration of his voice rattling the wooden bed frame. Ilara swallowed hard against her painfully swollen throat. She didn't have the use of her hands to gesture, so she relied entirely on the steady, unflinching conviction in her gaze. "Thorn is a fool, but he is a paranoid one," Ilara began, her voice a raspy whisper. "Before he sold me to my late husband, my Omega duties included cleaning the Alpha's private study. I have an eidetic memory, King Kalen. I know the exact structural schematics of the Crescent Moon's eastern fortifications." Kalen's golden pupils dilated slightly. The scent of ozone in the room grew sharper, sparking with genuine intrigue. "I know the blind spots in the silver dust perimeter," Ilara continued, pushing through the exhausting effort of speaking. "I know the shift rotations of the Vanguard, and, more importantly, I know the exact ledger of Thorn's illegal silver trade with the southern rogue factions. He is stockpiling weaponry meant to break Lycan Council law." Kalen slowly straightened to his full, terrifying height. He studied her, a master tactician evaluating a newly discovered weapon. She wasn't just a discarded, abused Omega. She was a Trojan horse carrying the keys to her father's destruction. "You would betray your own blood so easily?" Kalen asked smoothly, though there was no judgment in his tone, only a test. "My blood," Ilara countered, her voice hardening into ice, "chained my wrists in weaponized silver and left me to freeze in the Deadlands. My loyalty to the Crescent Moon died the moment those cuffs locked." Before Kalen could respond, the heavy iron door of the chamber swung open. An elderly woman with iron-gray hair and an apron stained with botanical salves bustled into the room. She carried a wooden tray laden with fresh bandages, mortar, and pestle. "Enough interrogating my patient, my king," the healer scolded, completely unaffected by Kalen's dominant aura. She set the tray on the bedside table. "The silver poison is neutralized, but the tissue damage is severe. She needs rest, not politics." Kalen took a measured step back, granting the healer space, though his gaze never left Ilara's face. "Will she regain the use of her hands, Maeve?" "In time. Months, perhaps," Maeve muttered, gently unwrapping the coarse bandages around Ilara's forearms. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut. Without the tight pressure of the bindings, the exposure to the air sent a fresh, sickening wave of agony up to her elbows. The flesh around her wrists was a horrific, charred black, rimmed with furious, infected red. Maeve applied a thick, cooling paste of crushed kingsfoil and snow lily. Ilara physically could not wipe the cold sweat that broke out across her forehead. Her body trembled uncontrollably as the nerve endings screamed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. Kalen stepped close to the head of the bed. The suffocating scent of wild honey and lightning enveloped her, fundamentally different from the sour, aggressive pine of her father. Kalen reached out with a damp linen cloth, gently wiping the cold sweat from her brow. It was a jarringly tender gesture from a man known as the Mad King, but functionally necessary. She couldn't do it herself. "Breathe, little wolf," he murmured, his voice a low, grounding rumble. As his skin brushed hers, that invisible electric jolt sparked again. The mate bond hummed beneath the surface, a primal tether desperately trying to flood her damaged body with restorative alpha energy. Ilara leaned marginally into his touch, drawing on his strength to endure the pain of the healer's work. Maev finished rewrapping the wrists, securing them tightly. "The necrosis is halted," the healer announced, wiping her hands. "But I need to check her core. Silver shock often causes internal hemorrhaging." Maev placed a warm, glowing hand flat against Ilara's lower abdomen, channeling a soft diagnostic magic. Ilara's breath hitched. "No." She tried to pull away, but her core muscles spasmed, pinning her flat. Maev went completely still. The healer's brow furrowed and she closed her eyes, pressing slightly deeper. A second later, Maev's eyes flew open in shock. She looked up at Kalen, then down at Ilara, her expression a mix of awe and terror. "My king," Maev whispered, her voice trembling. "The silver shock. It is a miracle she didn't miscarry." The temperature in the room plummeted. Kalen froze. The gentle hand holding the cloth to Ilara's forehead turned to stone. His storm-gray eyes snapped down to her heavily bandaged form, locking onto her lower abdomen. The air pressure doubled. The scent of lightning became a violent thunderstorm. "Leave us, Maev," Kalen ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. The healer didn't hesitate, abandoning her tray and fleeing the chamber, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. Ilara stared up at the towering Alpha King. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized his scent from the winter solstice. She knew exactly who the father of her child was. But Kalen had been masked that night, blinded by the darkness and the haze of a rut. He didn't know it was her, and she couldn't tell him. Not yet. If she claimed the Mad King was the father of her child now, she would sound like a desperate, manipulative Omega trying to secure a crown. He would never believe her. She had to be a strategist first. "Your father sent a pregnant Omega to die in the snow," Kalen said, the words dripping with a cold, lethal fury that seemed aimed entirely at Thorn. "My late husband was infertile," Ilara said evenly, maintaining her mask of composure despite the terror gripping her chest. "Thorn does not know about the child. If he did, he would have killed me in the courtyard to hide the shame of an Omega bearing an unclaimed bastard." Kalen leaned over her, planting a hand on the mattress on either side of her head, trapping her beneath the sheer, overwhelming mass of his chest. His wolf was right at the surface, his eyes flashing brilliant gold as he stared down at her. He inhaled deeply, pulling her scent into his lungs. "An unclaimed bastard," Kalen repeated, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to her eyes. "Then you are truly dead to the south, Ilara. To Thorn, you are a corpse in the Deadlands." He pushed off the bed, turning his broad back to her as he walked toward the roaring hearth. "You will remain here, in the Obsidian Keep," Kalen commanded, staring into the flames. "You will be given sanctuary in the lower archives while your hands heal. You will map out every weakness of the Crescent Pack for my generals. In exchange, you and your pup will be under my protection." Ilara let out a shaky breath, letting her head fall back against the pillows. She had done it. She had secured their survival. But as Kalen looked over his shoulder at her, the golden ring in his eyes hadn't faded. He stared at her abdomen, a deep, confused crease forming between his brows, as if his inner wolf was desperately trying to recognize a faint, familiar scent buried beneath the smell of kingsfoil and burned flesh. The lower archives of the Obsidian Keep smelled of dry parchment, aged leather bindings, and the ever-present medicinal tang of kingsfoil. It had been 3 weeks since Ilara had been pulled from the freezing jaws of the Deadlands, and the agonizing reality of her recovery had settled into a grueling daily routine. She stood over a massive, slanted oak drafting table, her breathing slightly elevated from the sheer effort of remaining upright. Her forearms were encased in rigid, boiled leather splints, heavily padded with linen to protect the fragile, newly grafted skin beneath. The necrotic decay had been halted by Mayev's magic and poultices, but the nerve damage was catastrophic. Her hands were trembling, stiff claws. She couldn't even hold a cup of water, let alone a quill. But her mind remained a lethal, perfectly sharpened blade. "No, Finn, you have the elevation wrong on the eastern ridge," Ilara instructed, her voice steady and commanding. Beside her, a young northern scribe furiously scratched a charcoal stick across a massive sheet of parchment. "Thorn placed the silver dust perimeter here," Ilara continued, using the blunt, leather-bound edge of her right splint to tap a specific quadrant on the map. "He assumes the natural steepness of the crag is a deterrent. It's a blind spot. If King Kalen's vanguard strikes at midnight during a new moon, the shift rotation leaves this sector entirely unmonitored for exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes, a deep, vibrating baritone echoed from the arched doorway. The atmospheric pressure in the archives instantly doubled. The ambient chill of the stone room evaporated, replaced by the crackling, static weight of a localized thunderstorm. Ilara didn't need to turn to know Kalen had arrived. The suffocating, intoxicating scent of wild honey and ozone flooded her senses, overriding the smell of dust and old paper. Kalen stepped into the light of the glow globes. He wore dark training leathers, his broad chest rising and falling rhythmically, carrying the faint sheen of sweat from the sparring rings. He dismissed the young scribe with a flick of his chin. Finn bowed hastily and scurried out, pulling the heavy iron door shut. Kalen approached the drafting table, his storm-gray eyes sweeping over the meticulously detailed map of the Crescent Moon's fortifications. "My generals spent 2 years trying to embed spies into Thorn's inner circle to get a fraction of this," Kalen murmured, his voice a low, appreciative rumble. He stepped up beside her, so close that the ambient heat radiating from his massive frame washed over her shivering skin. "You dismantled your father's entire defensive grid without picking up a single quill, Ilara. My body may be broken, my king, but my memory is flawless," Ilara replied. She kept her gaze fixed on the map, fighting the instinctual urge to submit to the overwhelming alpha aura pressing against her. "Thorn thinks in terms of brute force. He doesn't respect logistics. That is how you will break him." Kalen turned his head, studying her profile. The golden ring around his pupils flared. "And what of the illegal silver ledgers? I am having Finn cross-reference the shipment dates I memorized with the lunar cycles," she answered, shifting her weight. As she moved, a sudden, sharp wave of dizziness hit her. The prolonged standing combined with the lingering toxicity in her blood caught up to her all at once. Her knees buckled. She couldn't throw her hands out to catch herself on the table. Before she could hit the stone floor, Kalen moved with blinding, predatory speed. A massive arm wrapped around her waist, catching her mid-fall and pulling her flush against his solid, muscular chest. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, but it was the skin-to-skin contact where his hand gripped her unbandaged waist that sent a violent shockwave through them both. The mate bond flared to life, a desperate, humming current of primal energy. The agonizing throbbing in Ilara's ruined wrists instantly dulled, soothed by the restorative flood of his alpha strength. Kalen's breath hitched. He didn't let her go. Instead, his wolf surged forward. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. Ilara froze, her heart hammering wildly. Kalen growled, a low, confused sound vibrating deep in his chest. "Your scent," he rasped, his lips brushing against her pulse point. "It is buried under the Kingsfoil and the trauma. But there is something else." He shifted his grip, his large, calloused hand sliding protectively over the slight swell of her lower abdomen. Ilara panicked. Her baby. The child of the masked stranger. His child. If he recognized his own scent on the pup, all her strategic value would vanish, replaced by a devastating scandal. The pup is distressed by the silver trauma. Ilara lied smoothly, forcing her body to relax against him so he wouldn't sense her spike of terror. Omegas carry a different scent when they're unborn or fighting to survive. Kalen pulled back slightly, his brow furrowed in a dark scowl. His inner wolf was raging against his human logic, instinctively demanding he claim and protect the child, even though his rational mind believed it belonged to an abusive, deceased southern brute. It was a cognitive dissonance that made his eyes flash erratically between gray and gold. Before Kalen could interrogate her further, the heavy archive doors slammed open. Yarrick, the vanguard captain, stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. He held a blood-stained leather satchel in his hand. "Forgive the intrusion, my king," Jarek said, his eyes darting to where Kalen was holding Ilara. "But you need to see this." Kalen slowly released Ilara, carefully helping her balance against the drafting table before turning to his captain. The tender, confused mate vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless, mad king of the north. "Report. Our perimeter patrols intercepted a covert squad trying to scale the western cliffs of the keep," Jarek said grimly, tossing the satchel onto a nearby table. Silver daggers and heavy pouches of southern coins spilled out. They weren't military scouts. They were highly paid rogue assassins. Ilara's blood ran cold. "Assassins?" Kalen's voice dropped to a lethal, whisper-quiet frequency. "They had a map of the keep's lower levels, my king," Jarek confirmed, looking directly at Ilara. "Their target was the archives." Ilara gripped the edge of the table with her leather splints, her knuckles turning white beneath the bandages. Thorn wasn't just throwing a tantrum for the Lycan Council. Her father was a paranoid strategist. He had realized that if Ilara had survived the silver long enough for Kalen to capture her, her eidetic memory of his ledgers was a ticking time bomb. Thorn didn't want a war anymore. He wanted his daughter silenced. Permanently. The metallic, coppery tang of fresh blood from the leather satchel entirely overpowered the dry scent of parchment in the archives. Ilara stared at the spilled silver daggers, her breath hitching, though not from panic. Her mind, trained by 2 decades of survival under Thorn's tyrannical roof, immediately compartmentalized the terror. She leaned heavily on the drafting table, the thick leather of her forearm splints groaning under her weight. "They didn't scale the western cliffs," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the heavy, crackling silence of the room. Yarrick, the vanguard captain, bristled, his hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. "My perimeter guards found their climbing gear anchored to the rocks Omega. The evidence is—" "A diversion," Ilara interrupted smoothly, keeping her gaze locked on the daggers. "Thorn is paranoid, but he is not stupid. The western cliffs are coated in black ice this time of year. The sheer force of the wind off the Deadlands makes it mathematically impossible to ascend silently with southern-forged weaponry. It clinks. It drags." Kalen held up a hand, silencing his captain without a word. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, the ambient storm of his alpha aura narrowing, focusing entirely on Ilara with intense, calculating interest. "Explain." Ilara could not reach out to point, so she shifted her stance, using the blunt edge of her right splint to nudge the blood-stained map Jarek had thrown on the table. "Look at the parchment they carried," she instructed. "The edges aren't frayed by windburn. They are damp, curled. They didn't come over the walls, King Kalen. They came from beneath." She looked up, meeting Kalen's storm-gray eyes. 3 years ago, Thorn purchased ancient pre-war architectural schematics of the Obsidian Keep from a black market antiquities dealer. He was obsessed with your subterranean aqueducts, the drainage grates on the eastern ridge. Yarrick swore under his breath, the blood draining from his face. The eastern drains empty directly into the lower levels. They bypass the silver dust wards completely. Exactly, Ilara whispered, a fresh wave of exhaustion washing over her. The climbing gear was meant to draw your patrols west, leaving the eastern flank exposed. If they wanted to kill me, they wouldn't have brought heavy pouches of southern coin. That is bribe money. For whom? Kalen's voice was a lethal, vibrating purr. The keep's internal staff, Ilara deduced, her analytical mind spinning rapidly. Thorn knows I have the ledger memorized, but he also knows I am physically incapacitated. He didn't just send them to assassinate me. He sent them to burn the archives to the ground, destroying any physical maps I might have drafted for you. And to bribe a servant into poisoning my poultices. Kalen's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle feathered in his cheek. The scent of wild honey vanished, completely swallowed by the terrifying, suffocating odor of ozone and pure, unadulterated alpha rage. "Jarek," Kalen commanded, the word echoing off the stone like a thunderclap. "Seal the eastern drains. Purge the lower levels. Any servant found with southern coin is to be brought to the courtyard. And double the guard on the healer, Maeve. Now." Yarrick slammed his fist over his heart in a swift salute and sprinted from the room. The heavy iron doors boomed shut, leaving Ilara alone with the Mad King. The sudden adrenaline that had fueled her tactical deduction abruptly crashed. The severe tissue damage in her arms flared, a sickening, throbbing heat radiating from her blackened wrists. Her knees trembled, refusing to lock. She swayed dangerously. Kalen closed the distance between them in a single, fluid stride. He didn't just catch her this time. He slid one massive arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her entirely off the stone floor. "You are no longer safe in the lower levels," Kalen rumbled, his chest vibrating against her shoulder. "The archives are compromised." "My drafts," Ilara protested weakly, her core muscles clenching in agony at the sudden movement. "Are useless to me if you're dead," he stated, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. He carried her out of the archives and toward the grand spiral staircase of the keep. Ilara rested her head against his shoulder, lacking the physical strength to hold herself rigid. It was dangerous, being this close to him. The mate bond sang in her veins, a primal magnetic pull that desperately tried to knit her damaged nerves back together through his proximity. The scent of him, sharp lightning and sweet, intoxicating honey, was a potent sedative, unraveling her carefully constructed emotional defenses. "Where are you taking me?" she breathed, watching the stone corridors blur past. "The Alpha's spire," Kalen answered. "My personal quarters. The only way in is through my personal guard, and the walls are reinforced with deep earth iron. Thorn's rats will break their teeth trying to gnaw their way inside." Panic spiked through Ilara's chest, overriding her exhaustion. The Alpha's quarters, the inner sanctum. It would be saturated in his scent. Her inner Omega would be completely defenseless against the biological urge to submit to her true mate. Worse, she was pregnant with his child. As Kalen carried her up the final flight of stairs, he shifted her weight to open the heavy oak doors of his chambers. The movement pressed her lower abdomen flush against his hard stomach. Ilara gasped. Deep within her womb, a distinct, undeniable flutter occurred. The pup, sensing the overwhelming proximity of its true alpha sire, was responding. Kalen froze in the doorway. His storm-gray eyes went impossibly wide, the pupils instantly swallowed by a brilliant, feral gold. The protective instinct of his inner wolf surged so violently it was a physical force in the room. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to where her body pressed against his. "It moved," Kalen rasped, his voice raw, stripped of all its kingship. leaving only the confused, instinct-driven alpha. The pup, it reached out to my aura. Ilara's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. If he realized the truth now, he would know she had withheld the identity of his own heir. It was treason of the highest order. Alpha auras are grounding, Ilara lied, her voice trembling slightly, though she hoped he attributed it to the pain in her arms. The silver trauma terrified the pup. Your strength. It is merely seeking safety, King Kalen. It is instinctual survival. Kalen slowly carried her into the cavernous, fire-lit bedroom, his golden eyes searching her pale face for any sign of deceit. He gently laid her down on the massive, fur-strewn bed, but he didn't pull away. He hovered over her, his large hands resting on the mattress beside her head. Survival, Kalen echoed, his gaze dropping to her lips. The intoxicating smell of crushed wolfsbane wrapped around her like a physical embrace. Then you must survive this, Ilara. Because Thorn's desperation tells me one thing. Ilara forced herself to meet his piercing gaze, pushing her secret down into the darkest depths of her mind. It tells us that his timeline has changed, she whispered, her strategic mind re-engaging to build a wall between them. If he is risking exposure to silence me now, the southern border attack isn't coming next season, my king. Kalen's eyes narrowed, the golden mate glow cooling back into the storm gray of a warlord. It's coming on the next full moon, Ilara finished, a cold dread settling in her stomach. 3 days from now. For 48 hours, the Alpha's spire served as both Ilara's gilded sanctuary and the Obsidian Keep's primary war room. The isolation was an absolute necessity. With the lower levels compromised and Thorn's bribes proving his reach, Kalen trusted no one but his highest generals to cross the threshold of his private quarters, and even they were not permitted past the heavy iron doors when Ilara's bandages were changed. Ilara sat propped against the velvet-tufted headboard of Kalen's massive bed, her jaw locked in silent endurance. Maeve, the elderly healer, carefully sliced through the thick, stiff linen that had encased Ilara's forearms for 3 weeks. As the heavily soiled bandages fell away, the overwhelming medicinal stench of kingsfoil and snow lily finally dissipated from the room. Ilara stared at her arms, her breathing shallow. The horrific, blackened necrosis was gone, replaced by taut, violently pink skin that looked paper-thin and exquisitely tender. Her fingers were no longer swollen, but they remained slightly curled inward, stiff and completely unresponsive to her brain's frantic commands. The silver is fully purged from the muscle tissue, Maeve murmured, applying a much lighter, odorless salve to the new skin. But the nerve pathways are still shattered. You will wear soft leather bracers to keep the wrists straight. But you must not attempt to lift anything. A single tear in this new flesh could cause permanent tendon retraction. I understand, Ilara whispered, using her elbows to awkwardly pull the heavy fur blanket back over her lap as Massive packed her supplies. The heavy oak doors opened. Kalen stepped inside, dismissing Maeve with a silent nod. The healer slipped out, the lock clicking heavily into place behind her. The atmospheric pressure in the room immediately shifted. Without the suffocating barrier of the kingsfoil poultice, Kalen's scent, sharp ozone, crushed wolfsbane, and wild honey, hit Ilara with devastating, unmitigated force. Her inner omega whined, a biological urge to bare her throat to the overpowering alpha in her immediate space. She fought it viciously, keeping her chin level and her eyes cold. Kalen walked straight to the massive mahogany desk near the roaring hearth, his eyes never leaving hers. He picked up a stick of charcoal and unrolled a fresh sheet of parchment. For the past 2 days, the Mad King had served as her personal scribe, translating her eidetic memory into actionable battle plans. "The vanguard is in position," Kalen rumbled, the deep timbre of his voice vibrating against the stone walls. "The southern ridge is fortified. Now, tell me about the gorge. Thorn's heavy cavalry cannot maneuver through the eastern pass." "They won't try," Alara said, her strategic mind easily overriding her physical discomfort. She gestured toward the desk with a slight jut of her chin. "Thorn uses a wedge formation. He relies on momentum. He will use the natural fog that rolls off the Deadlands at dusk to mask the approach of his infantry, drawing your archer's fire toward the center." Kalen sketched rapidly, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his dark linen tunic. "A feint, yes," Alara confirmed. "While your archers are distracted by the center, his sappers will scale the blind spots I showed you on the western ridge. They don't want to breach the gates. They want to trigger an avalanche to bury your vanguard alive." Kalen stopped writing. The charcoal snapped in his grip. He looked up, his storm-gray eyes flashing with genuine, profound respect. It wasn't the predatory look of an alpha evaluating a mate. It was the look of a king recognizing an equal. "He sent his greatest tactical weapon to die in the snow," Kalen said softly, crossing the room until he stood at the edge of the bed. "His arrogance will be his tomb." As Kalen approached, his nostrils flared. He stopped dead. The golden ring around his pupils instantly expanded, swallowing the gray entirely. With the overpowering smell of the healing herbs finally gone, Ilara's true scent filled the air between them. And more dangerously, so did the scent of the child she carried. Ilara's heart slammed against her ribs. She tried to subtly shift backward, but there was nowhere to go. Kalen leaned over her, bracing his massive hands on the mattress. His chest brushed her knees through the blankets. He closed his eyes, inhaling a deep, trembling breath, his face hovering mere inches from the crook of her neck. "Your late husband," Kalen growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, vibrating frequency that made Ilara's newly healed skin prickle. What was his scent? Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her veins. "Ash," she lied quickly. "And stale blood." Kalen's eyes snapped open. The gold in them was blinding, feral, and utterly furious. "Then explain to me," he demanded, his hand moving with agonizing slowness to rest firmly, possessively over the swell of her lower abdomen. "Why this pup smells like wild honey in the storm." Ilara froze. The lie died on her tongue. The sheer force of his alpha aura was no longer supportive. It was an interrogation, heavy and demanding truth. The mate bond between them shrieked in recognition. The child shifted under his palm, drawn magnetically to its sire's touch. "Who were you in the dark on the winter solstice, Ilara?" Kalen breathed, his thumb tracing the curve of her belly, piecing the impossible puzzle together. "Who?" A deafening, earth-shattering horn blast ripped through the night air, cutting Kalen off. It wasn't a northern horn. It was a dissonant, jagged wail that echoed violently off the stone walls of the spire. The southern war horn. Kalen's head snapped toward the balcony window. The golden mate glow in his eyes warred violently with the steel gray of the warlord. "The full moon hasn't risen yet," Ilara gasped, her tactical mind instantly catching the terrifying anomaly. "It's dusk. He's early." Heavy boots pounded against the stone corridor outside. "My king!" Jarek's muffled voice bellowed through the oak doors. "They used a weather mage. The valley fog is blinding, and they are already at the outer walls. Thorn is demanding a parley at the gates." Kalen looked back down at Ilara, his chest heaving, his jaw locked in a vicious sneer of realization. The pieces had clicked. He knew she was the Omega from the solstice. He knew the child was his heir. And Thorn was at his gates, entirely unaware that the pawn he threw away was actually the queen that would destroy him. "Do not move from this bed," Kalen commanded, The Mad King fully re-emerging, his voice a lethal promise of absolute slaughter. "I'm going to bring you your father's head." The heavy oak doors slammed shut, the booming echo vibrating through the soles of Ilara's boots. Kaelin was gone. Ilara stood perfectly still in the center of the cavernous bedroom, her chest heaving as the ambient pressure of the room equalized in the Alpha King's absence. The suffocating, intoxicating scent of ozone and wild honey remained in the air, wrapping around her like a phantom shield. Kaelin knew. The terrifying Mad King of the North had pieced the impossible puzzle together. He knew she was the masked Omega from the winter solstice, and he knew the child she carried was his heir. But there was no time to process the earth-shattering revelation. The dissonant, jagged wail of the southern war horn blasted again, shaking dust from the stone rafters. Ilara moved toward the massive arched window that opened onto the Alpha's private balcony. Her forearms, encased in the soft, rigid leather bracers Maiev had provided to keep her wrists straight, ached with a dull, persistent throb. She could not grip the heavy iron latch to open the glass doors, so she leaned her shoulder against the frame, pressing her forehead to the freezing pane to look out over the battlefield. Below, the courtyard of the Obsidian Keep was a hive of organized lethality. Northern warriors in heavy armor moved with silent, terrifying efficiency, their massive, dire wolves already shifting in the shadows. But beyond the outer walls, the valley was wrong. The natural dusk had been swallowed by an unnatural fog. It wasn't rolling down from the high peaks. It was creeping up from the valley floor, unnaturally thick, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. It moved against the wind, rolling toward the keep's iron gates like a living, breathing entity. Thorn's parley. It was a stalling tactic. Ilara's eidetic memory word, rapidly cross-referencing the logistical ledgers she had memorized over the past 3 years. Alchemical silver dust. 40 crates imported from the eastern rogues. Thorn hadn't just bought climbing gear and broadswords. He had bought chemical warfare, a faint, metallic tang, like a mouthful of tarnished coins, seeped through the microscopic drafts in the window seals. "It's a suspension," Ilara whispered in horror, her breath fogging the glass. "The weather mage isn't just blinding the archers. He's drowning the vanguard." She turned away from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She couldn't fight, and she couldn't wield a blade, but her mind was the sharpest weapon in the keep. "Guards!" Ilara shouted, projecting her voice from her diaphragm. It wasn't the trembling whimper of an abused Omega. It rang with the crystal clarity of a battlefield commander. The heavy doors swung inward. 2 massive northern sentries stepped into the room, their broadswords drawn, their eyes glowing with their inner wolves. "The king commanded you stay in this bed, Omega," the taller guard growled, his alpha aura flaring defensively. Ilara didn't cower. She stepped directly into his space, letting the heavy, saturated scent of Kaelin's wild honey, which now clung to her skin and clothes, wash over the sentries. She couldn't project her own aura, so she weaponized her mates. "And I command you to listen to me if you want your king to survive the hour." Ilara fired back, holding her ground. She gestured toward the window with the blunt edge of her leather bracer. "The fog in the valley is laced with aerosolized alchemical silver. The parley is a trap to keep Kaelin at the gates. The moment your vanguard inhales that mist, their lungs will blister. They will suffocate on their own blood before they can even shift." The guards stiffened. Their flared nostrils caught the faint, metallic poison bleeding through the stone walls. The taller guard's eyes widened in realization. "How do we clear it?" he demanded, his alpha pride instantly yielding to her undeniable strategic logic. "The keep's geothermal vents," Ilara instructed rapidly, her mind visualizing the ancient architectural schematics Thorn had bought. This fortress was built over deep earth hot springs. If you open the primary downdraft flues in the lower archives and uncap the thermal geysers in the courtyard trenches, the sudden heat-updraft will create a massive thermal wall. The sentries stared at her, stunned by her intimate knowledge of their own ancestral home. "It will blow the fog directly back into the valley," Ilara finished, her eyes burning with fierce determination. "Right over my father's infantry." The guards exchanged a single, decisive look. They slammed their fists over their hearts in a crisp northern salute. One bolted down the spiral staircase to relay the order to the engineers. The other stepped out to secure the corridor, leaving the door cracked so Ilara could hear the chaotic symphony of war. Ilara hurried back to the window, leaning heavily against the glass. Down at the massive iron gates of the keep, the heavy portcullis ground upward. King Kalen strode out into the swirling, toxic mist entirely alone, an imposing figure of absolute, lethal dominance. Across the frosted battlefield, Thorn sat atop a heavily armored warhorse, safely outside the thickest part of the fog, surrounded by a phalanx of southern elites. Thorn's voice, magically amplified by his hired mage, echoed up the mountain, vibrating with sickening arrogance. "King Kalen," Thorn bellowed, "I have come for the head of the treacherous Omega you harbor. Hand over my murderous daughter, or I will let this fog consume your vanguard and turn your keep to rubble." Ilara held her breath, her newly grafted skin prickling with adrenaline. Below, Kalen didn't yell. He didn't draw a sword. He simply stood his ground, looking at the southern alpha with a gaze of profound, terrifying pity. Kalen slowly raised his right hand. Suddenly, a colossal, thunderous groan erupted from deep within the obsidian keep. The stone floors of the Alpha's spire vibrated beneath Ilara's boots. The engineers had uncapped the vents. A massive, continuous blast of superheated air erupted from the grated trenches surrounding the outer walls. The sheer force of the geothermal updraft collided violently with the weather mage's unnatural fog. The silver-laced mist hit the invisible thermal wall and instantly rebounded. Ilara watched in grim satisfaction as the toxic cloud washed rapidly backward, rolling directly over Thorn's front line. Instantly, the southern warhorses reared in agony, their sensitive lungs burning. Screams of terror erupted from Thorn's infantry as they inhaled their own chemical weapon. Their tight wedge formation collapsed into a chaotic, choking mass of blind panic. Thorn's horse bucked violently, throwing the southern alpha backward into the snow. Through the rapidly dissipating fog at the gates, Kalen's form began to shift. It wasn't a normal transition. It was an explosive, violent expansion of bone, muscle, and dark fur. The Mad King transformed into a monstrous, pitch-black dire wolf, the size of a warhorse, his eyes burning with a feral, blinding gold that pierced the dusk. As the colossal beast let out a roar that shattered the remaining glass in the southern watchtowers, Ilara finally let herself smile. Her father had come to the north to sacrifice a pawn, only to discover the queen had already rigged the board. From her vantage point at the balcony window, Ilara witnessed the absolute, terrifying supremacy of the Mad King. Kalen's dire wolf form was a nightmare of muscle, shadow, and lethal grace. He did not simply break the southern vanguard, he shattered their psychological will to fight. He moved like a localized hurricane through the choking, retreating southern infantry, his massive jaws snapping broadswords in half as easily as dry twigs. The northern warriors, invigorated by their alpha's monstrous display, surged from the keep's gates to flank the suffocating enemy. Within 10 minutes, the siege was over. The southern forces, blinded by their own aerosolized silver and hopelessly outmatched by the northern beasts, threw their weapons into the blood-stained snow. Ilara watched as Kalen's colossal wolf stalked toward the center of the carnage. Thorn, covered in mud and gasping for breath, was violently hauled to his feet by Jarek and another northern general. The dire wolf let out a low, bone-rattling snarl, shifting fluidly back into his human form. Kylan stood naked amidst the freezing snow, entirely impervious to the cold, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the southern alpha. A lieutenant quickly draped a heavy fur mantle over Kalen's broad shoulders. Kalen didn't execute Thorn in the snow. He grabbed the southern alpha by the collar of his ornate armor and dragged him toward the keep's gates. "Take me to the Great Hall," Ilara commanded, turning away from the glass. The two northern sentries guarding her door immediately crossed their polearms, blocking her path. "The king ordered you to remain in this bed, Omega. The battle is over," Ilara replied, her voice cold and unyielding. She pressed her elbows against her sides, unable to use her stiff, leather-bound hands, but her posture was the epitome of Luna dominance. "The king is bringing Alpha Thorn to the Great Hall for judgment. I am the architect of Thorn's defeat, and I will not cower in a bedroom while my abuser's fate is decided. Escort me, or I will walk there myself and risk tearing the skin on the stairwell. The choice is yours." The guards exchanged a hesitant look before lowering their weapons, yielding to the undeniable authority radiating from her. The descent down the grand spiral staircase was agonizing. Ilara's knees trembled, her core muscles burning as she carefully balanced her weight without the use of her hands to grip the banister. By the time she reached the landing overlooking the cavernous Great Hall, a cold sweat coated her neck. The heavy oak doors of the keep slammed open. Kalen strode into the hall, his alpha aura so suffocatingly heavy that the torches lining the stone walls flickered and dimmed. He threw Thorn onto the obsidian floor. The southern alpha hit the stone with a sickening crack, his armor rattling. The air in the room was a violent clash of scents. The sharp, terrifying ozone of Kalen's wrath entirely dominated the sour, rotting pine of Thorn's sheer panic. "You savage," Thorn spat, coughing up a mixture of blood and silver dust as he struggled to his knees. "The Lycan Council will have your head for this. Unprovoked slaughter. Unprovoked?" Kalen's voice was a lethal, vibrating purr that echoed through the silent hall. "You brought alchemical weapons to my gates, Thorn. You attempted to bribe my staff, and you sent assassins to murder an Omega under my protection." Thorn let out a ragged, arrogant laugh. "Protection? She is a disgraced murderer, a pregnant whore who killed her husband. By pact law, her life is mine to forfeit. Hand her over, and I will consider calling off the Council's retaliation. She is not yours to claim." A steady, crystal-clear voice rang out from above. Thorn's head snapped up. Kalen's storm-gray eyes instantly darted to the staircase, flashing with a brilliant, possessive gold as he saw her. Ilara stood on the landing, flanked by the massive northern sentries. She looked pale, her forearms heavily bound in the rigid leather bracers, but her chin was held high. The ambient pressure of Kalen's aura shifted the moment she appeared, softening around her, wrapping her in the invisible, protective scent of wild honey. "Ilara!" Thorn snarled, his eyes widening in disbelief. He instantly tried to weaponize his alpha command, projecting a wave of subjugating force up the stairs. "Get on your knees, you useless bitch!" Ilara didn't even flinch. The command washed over her, entirely neutralized by the mate bond tethering her to the vastly superior alpha in the room. "Your voice has no power over me, Thorn," Ilara said coldly, taking a careful step down. "Your strategy was flawed. Your ledger is in my hands, and your reign is over." "You are nothing," Thorn roared, his desperation turning to madness. "You carry the bastard of a dead man. You have no pack, no status." "The only bastard in this room is you, Thorn," Kalen interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, earth-shaking frequency. Kalen closed the distance to the staircase, looking up at Ilara. The feral gold in his eyes was blinding now. a perfect fusion of the Mad King and the devoted mate. He had pieced it all together, the timeline, the scent, the undeniable pull of the pup. Kalen turned back to the broken Southern Alpha. "The child she carries does not belong to a dead man," Kalen declared, his voice carrying the absolute, undeniable weight of a royal decree. "It belongs to the shadows of the winter solstice. It smells of wild honey in the storm." Thorn froze, the blood draining from his face as the catastrophic realization hit him. "She is not a disgraced exile," Kalen continued, stepping up to the bottom of the stairs and looking at Ilara with profound, reverent awe. "She is my true mate. She is the mother of my heir. She is the Queen of the North." A deafening silence fell over the great hall. The northern generals immediately dropped to one knee, bowing their heads in deep submission to their newly revealed Luna. Thorn collapsed back onto his heels, his mouth opening and closing in silent, abject horror. His geopolitical masterstroke hadn't just failed. He had personally delivered the ultimate weapon to his greatest enemy and bound their bloodlines together. "My king," Jarek asked from the shadows, his hand on the hilt of his broadsword. "Shall I take his head?" Kalen looked at Ilara, relinquishing his absolute authority to her. "He is your father, my queen, and your abuser. His fate is yours to decide." Ilara stared down at the man who had chained her in silver and left her to die. Her mind, as always, calculated the most devastating route. "Execution makes him a martyr to his loyalists in the south," Ilara said, her voice echoing clearly off the stone. "Do not give him the dignity of a warrior's death." She met Thorn's terrified eyes. "Strip his wolf, sever his bond to the crescent moon, and cast him into the Deadlands as a human. Let him see how long he survives the cold without a pack." Thorn screamed, scrambling backward. "No, Ilara, please!" "It is done," Kalen snarled. The Mad King stepped forward, placing his massive hand over Thorn's chest, his golden eyes glowing as he invoked the ancient, brutal rite of a conquering alpha to shatter a subjugated wolf's core. Thorn's agonizing shriek echoed through the keep, but Ilara did not look away. She simply closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of ozone and honey, finally, truly free. The winter sun cast a brilliant, crystalline light over the obsidian keep, reflecting off the pristine snow that blanketed the valley. It had been exactly 1 month since the siege, and the air no longer carried the sharp, terrifying metallic tang of chemical warfare. Instead, the Alpha's private study smelled of fresh parchment, hot spiced tea, and the deep, anchoring warmth of ozone and wild honey. Ilara sat at the head of the long mahogany table, resting her forearms on the padded velvet of the armrests. The rigid, boiled leather splints had finally been downgraded by Maziv to soft, supple deer-hide bracers. The agonizing burn in her wrists was gone, replaced by a dull, constant ache. Her fingers were no longer curled into stiff claws, but she still lacked the fine motor control to hold a quill. She didn't need one. "The Lycan Council has formally ratified the annexation," Finn, the young northern scribe, read aloud, his charcoal scratching furiously across the ledger. "With the submission of Thorn's financial records detailing his illegal weaponization of Silva, the Council has declared the Crescent Moon Territory a protectorate of the North." "And the southern civilians?" Ilara asked, her voice calm and authoritative. "General Jarek reports a seamless transition, my queen," Finn replied, bowing his head respectfully. "With Thorn stripped of his wolf and banished to the Deadlands as a human, the loyalist enforcers fractured. The common pack members welcomed the northern vanguard. They were starving under Thorn's taxation." "Good," Ilara said, leaning back into her chair. "Ensure a caravan of winter grain is dispatched to the southern borders before the next blizzard. A conquered people will only rebel if they are hungry. We will feed them, and they will realize the Mad King is a far better ruler than the father they lost." The heavy oak doors swung open, The atmospheric pressure in the room didn't spike with aggressive dominance. Instead, it settled, wrapping around Alara like a heavy, protective blanket. Kalen strode into the study. He wore his dark royal leathers, but the ferocious warlord had been entirely replaced by the devoted mate. His storm-gray eyes were soft, the golden ring around his pupils glowing with a steady, purring warmth as he looked at her. "Leave us, Finn," Kalen rumbled gently. The scribe immediately gathered his scrolls and scurried from the room, pulling the door shut behind him. Kalen crossed the expanse of the study, bypassing his own chair to kneel on the stone floor beside Alara's. He was a mountain of lethal muscle and ancient power, yet he willingly lowered himself to eye level with his physically compromised queen. He gently took her right arm, his large, calloused thumbs tracing the soft leather of her bracer with exquisite care. "Maev says the nerve tissue is regenerating faster than she anticipated," Kalen murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that resonated directly in Alara's chest. "You moved your index finger this morning." "I am too stubborn to remain helpless," Alara replied, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "You were never helpless, Alara," Kalen corrected softly, looking up into her eyes. The scent of lightning crackled faintly in the room, not with anger, but with profound reverence. "You broke a siege from a sickbed. You conquered an enemy kingdom using only your memory and your mind. You are the most terrifying creature in this keep." Alara's breath hitched. She didn't have to maintain a mask of cold, calculated survival anymore. The grueling, terrifying hypervigilance that had defined her entire life in the South was finally dissolving, washed away by the absolute security of the mate bond. Kalen shifted his grip, one hand moving from her leather bracer to rest lightly over the pronounced swell of her abdomen. The moment his palm made contact, a distinct, powerful kick vibrated against his hand. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. His eyes flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. He let out a breathless, rumbling chuckle, leaning his forehead against the armrest of her chair. "A warrior," Kalen whispered, awe lacing every syllable. "He is restless today," Alara admitted, resting her own heavily wrapped arm atop Kalen's massive hand. "I thought I'd lost you," Kalen confessed, the vulnerability in his voice a jarring, beautiful contrast to his terrifying reputation. He lifted his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "On the winter solstice. The darkness. The haze of my rut. By the time I regained enough human logic to track your scent, you had vanished. I searched the borderlands for months. When I found you freezing in the snow, I didn't know it was you. The silver and the kingsfoil masked everything. I couldn't tell you," Alara whispered, the memory of her terror still a phantom ache in her chest. "If I had claimed you were the father while I was still Thorn's pawn, I thought you would see it as a desperate manipulation." "I see a queen who protected our heir at all costs," Kalen vowed, leaning in to brush a soft, lingering kiss against her lips. The electric shock of the mate bond sparked between them, a current of pure, unconditional belonging. Kalen stood, gently gathering Alara into his arms. He didn't carry her out of weakness, but out of reverence. He carried her out to the Alpha's private balcony. He didn't need to kick the heavy glass doors open this time. He unlatched them easily, carrying her out into the crisp, bracing winter air. Below them, the courtyard of the Obsidian Keep was alive with the bustling, organized energy of a thriving pack. Northern warriors trained in the rings, children chased each other through the snowdrifts, and the banners of the crescent moon now flew peacefully alongside the dire wolf of the north. There were no more wars to fight. There were no more abusers to outsmart. Alara rested her head against Kalen's broad shoulder, breathing in the scent of wild honey, ozone, and the crisp winter morning. She looked out over the vast, snow-capped mountains of her new kingdom, the leather bracers on her wrists a testament to her survival, and the powerful Alpha holding her a testament to her ultimate victory. The pawns had been sacrificed, the king had been outplayed, and the Queen of the North had finally claimed her board. And that concludes our epic saga of the family sent the widowed Omega as a punishment. But she was the treasure Alpha had. Thank you so much for journeying into the snowy peaks of the Obsidian Keep with us. It has been an absolute thrill to bring Alara and Kalen's story to life for you all. If you felt the chill of the Deadlands and the sparks of the mate bond, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next high-stakes romance. I want to hear from you in the comments. Which moment was your absolute favorite? Was it Alara outsmarting her father's chemical attack from her sickbed? Or the deeply satisfying moment Kalen shattered Thorn's alpha core in the Great Hall? Let me know down below. And please share this audio novel with a friend who loves a fiercely intelligent female lead. Writing this story was a deliberate exercise in challenging the traditional damsel in distress tropes often found in alpha-omega dynamics. I wanted to create a female lead whose true power wasn't physical dominance or sudden magical abilities, but raw, unfiltered intellect and strategic foresight. By physically incapacitating Alara with the severe silver burns to her hands, the narrative forced her to rely entirely on her mind. She couldn't pick up a sword. She had to wield her eidetic memory and logistical brilliance instead. This structural choice made her agency far more compelling. Kalen, the Mad King, is drawn to her not just because of biological fate, but because she proves herself to be his intellectual equal and a terrifyingly competent queen. The story's ultimate theme is empowerment through resilience. Alara takes the very punishment meant to kill her, her exile, and weaponizes it to dismantle her abuser's empire, proving that the mind is always the deadliest weapon on the battlefield.